Okay, so today we're going to take a look at some energy releasing pathways that animals use in order to get energy. So the introduction to this, again, as I mentioned before, is that living cells require energy from outside sources in order to perform the many tasks that they must do. So the question is, how do cells obtain the energy that we need? How do we get the energy that we need? Where does the energy come from? Does anyone know?
The sun, food, water.
Food and water. Okay, so that is the correct answer for two different types of organisms that we're going to talk about today. Autotrophs, like plants, green animals, photosynthetic organisms rather, utilize the sun as their major source of energy, right? However, that process is different for animals and humans. All right, we get our energy from food consumption. So we're going to take a look at that today. Some mechanisms for acquiring energy. All right. As I said before, and you should make a note of this, that autotrophs are those types of organisms that makes the ATP or energy that they need through a process known as photosynthesis. And this process of photosynthesis is fueled from sunlight energy. All right, so I know that you've heard about photosynthesis and you know what this process is. All right, so we're going to take a look today at a little bit more detail about how animals and humans, all right, so most other organisms apart from photosynthesizing organisms make ATP by breaking down glucose and other organic substances via a process known as cellular respiration. So go ahead and jot this down today. We're going to take a look at this process of cellular respiration. Where does the energy come from that fuels our bodies? It's coming from the foods that we eat that's going to be broken down through a process known as cellular respiration. Okay, so most other organisms, humans included, utilize this process of cellular respiration in order to release energy into our bodies so that our bodies can carry out other processes that it needs to. So anyway, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are sort of inverse operations. We're going to look at the chemical reactions or the equations for both of these reactions and see how they have the same four components involved. We're going to take a look at the reactants and products for each of these reactions. I do want you to note the cellular location of these processes, right? So photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast of plants. You need to make a note of that. While cellular respiration takes place in the mitochondria, right, of eukaryotic cells. All right, so I know when we hear the term respiration, like a lot of times we just start thinking about breathing, but we're not talking about respiring or respiration in that context today. We're actually talking about the process of breaking down organic substances like carbohydrates, lipids, fats in order to get energy released into the body. All right, so let's not confuse those two. So the goal here that we're trying to do is release energy into the organism. All right, we're gonna take a look at that today. And so this falls under that requirement of metabolism for living things. Remember early in the semester, we identified this common set of properties that all living things exhibit. Well, metabolism was one of those, right? But metabolism is just a general term for all of the chemical reactions that takes place within an organism, right? But there are certain types of metabolism or specific types of metabolism. There are reactions that build up and synthesize new molecules, and we'll call that type of metabolism anabolism. So there are anabolic pathways that our bodies utilize in order to build and make new molecules, right? And then there is another type of metabolism where substances, molecules, compounds are broken down. Okay, and we call that catabolism. So jot these two terms down, anabolism and catabolism, and you should be able to define and contrast these two types of reactions that take place in living things, right? So we know that our bodies are constantly undergoing chemical reactions all day long, and these chemical reactions can be either anabolic or catabolic. We're going to look today at some catabolic pathways where we break down glucose, which is our preferred energy source, right, in order to get this ATP released into our bodies, right? And that catabolic pathway is going to be cellular respiration. Okay, so let's look again here at catabolic pathways. Catabolic pathways yield energy by breaking down organic substances. So those carbohydrates, proteins, fats that we all consume in our foods are going to be used in order to generate energy for our bodies. Okay, now the preferred source is going to be our carbohydrates, right? But in the absence of carbs or glucose, our body starts to also burn fats in order to release energy. So two catabolic pathways that we want to take a look at today. There are two pathways by which ATP can be generated from the foods that we eat. One, as I said before, is cellular respiration. This is also referred to as aerobic respiration, depending on whatever source that you're using. So go ahead and write that down or make a note that if you see these two terms, they can be used interchangeably. Aerobic respiration and cellular respiration are the same process, all right? And then we'll take a look at fermentation. Fermentation is a catabolic pathway, but it has a different sort of rate limiting factor here, and it happens in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so one thing you can also note about cellular respiration or aerobic respiration is that this catabolic pathway requires oxygen. Okay, and that's kind of indicated by this name, aerobic respiration. This is an oxygen requiring pathway. So we're going to take a look now at how cellular respiration occurs. We know that this is taking place in the mitochondria, right? We've already learned about the different structures and organelles of the eukaryotic cell, and we know that we refer to the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell because that's where energy is generated, right? So that's where cellular respiration takes place. So aerobic respiration is used by most eukaryotic organisms, right? And so humans, we're going to fall in that category. And by definition, we're going to say that cellular respiration is a process that breaks down glucose in a series of steps, right? And the goal here is to convert that biochemical energy in our foods into these usable ATP molecules for our bodies. Now, I'll go ahead and kind of preface the rest of this these slides by saying that there are a lot of steps, there are a lot of details involved in cellular respiration. We're going to take a moment to just highlight some of the key points here that happens and make sure you get the big picture. Now, there are some more very fine details that you'll get a chance to see again in some of your upper level classes in microbiology and your cellular biology. You go into a lot more detail, but right now I don't want us to get lost in those very fine details, but I do want to make sure that we get the big picture of what's happening during cellular respiration and what the products are. So cellular respiration, as I said, is a chemical reaction in which we're breaking down these glucose molecules in order to release energy. This is the chemical reaction for cellular respiration right here. Jot that down. Okay, so when we look at this chemical equation, and chemical equation is basically representing what's going on in a chemical reaction. So we have two sides of our equation here. We have our reactants on one side, and we have our products on the other side. Okay, so you should practice reading and understanding what's going on when you see a chemical equation representing what's going on in a chemical reaction. So these reactants over here on our left-hand side are basically the substances that are participating in the reaction, okay? You've got this arrow right here that means yields, okay? Whenever you see this arrow in chemistry or biology, it means that it yields, so it's indicating that something else is going to be produced. Okay, and then on the right side of our arrow, we have our products. So these are the substances that are being made, all right? We start with what's on the left and we end up with what's on the right, and it's usually going to be a different molecule or compound being generated. So anyway, the equation for cellular respiration is oxygen plus glucose yields carbon dioxide, water, and a release of energy. Now I want you to just stop for a moment to make this make sense intuitively. So we're saying that we're eukaryotic organisms, we're humans, we utilize this process of cellular respiration. So intuitively, you can think about the things that we require for sustaining life. You know that we require oxygen, right, in order to breathe. We require glucose molecules. We require food sources, right, for sustaining. And then we take in oxygen, we take in food, all right? We release what when we breathe? Carbon dioxide. Water is going to be a byproduct of this reaction, and energy is going to be released into our bodies. This is what happens every day when we consume food, okay? This is why when you go a long period of time without eating, you will feel a little tired. You will feel a little lethargic, okay? That's because your body doesn't have anything to work with. If your energy sources are depleted, then you will feel tired, okay? So this is a real situation that takes place in our bodies. All right, this is just a schematic that I like for those of us that are visual. So again, what's going on in our bodies every day? This process of cellular respiration is taking place whether you want it to or not. So you're breathing in air, right? Oxygen. You're consuming food on a day-to-day basis, and you're exhaling carbon dioxide. You know, water is generated, and energy is being released into your bodies. That's what happens during cellular respiration. Okay, so let's take a look at where and how this happens. Aerobic respiration takes place over 3 stages. Write this down. There are 3 stages or steps for aerobic respiration. Those 3 steps, I want you to be able to identify their names, what these steps are called, and where they take place cellularly, right? So the first stage of aerobic respiration is glycolysis, okay? This process starts out in the cytoplasm of the cell, right? And that's what this schematic over here is sort of illustrating for us, okay? We have 3 different stages of aerobic respiration. They're taking place in different locales in the cell, and they're each gonna have a different output of energy being produced at each stage, right? So remember, the overall goal here is that we're trying to generate some ATP. So glycolysis is the first stage. I'm sure you've heard about it. At least you've heard about glycolysis before in your high school biology class. All right. The next stage is the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. You've probably heard about that before. Now, we said that glycolysis takes place out here in the cytoplasm, right? We're out in the cytoplasm. Well, this process then moves over into the mitochondria. And the last 2 stages of aerobic respiration take place in the mitochondria. And this is where we're going to get our most abundant production of ATP, in the mitochondria. So the Krebs cycle takes place inside the mitochondria. There's going to be some ATP generated from the Krebs cycle. Okay. And then we have the electron transport chain. Go ahead and put a nice asterisk by the electron transport chain, as this is the most productive stage, or the most productive stage of aerobic respiration, and the most ATP is going to be generated from the electron transport chain. Okay. So just, as we're going through these next couple of slides, I just want you to kind of think big picture on what's happening here. We're starting with glucose, right? We've consumed some foods. Our bodies basically need to break down those carbs. So we're going to say that glucose is our starting organic substance that we want to break down, okay? Glucose is going to enter the cell. We talked about like transport mechanisms and so forth. How do we get this glucose into the cell? And the first stage of aerobic respiration, which is breaking down this glucose, is going to be glycolysis. All right. There's going to be some amount of ATP generated. Process will continue over in the mitochondria, where we get the Krebs cycle producing some amount of ATP. And then we have the electron transport chain also generating some amounts of ATP. So now I mentioned, of course, that there's a little bit more fine details going on with this process. There are a lot of enzymes involved. There are different intermediate molecules being produced. We'll get to those. You will get to those. And so if we're just kind of looking at the big picture here, to summarize what happens during aerobic respiration, we start with glycolysis as the first step. And so we're trying to break down these glucose molecules. And so that first step of breaking down glucose is going to produce an intermediate molecule known as pyruvate. Write that down. Pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, is going to be sort of one of the first intermediate process molecules being made during glycolysis. Okay. The end result of glycolysis is going to be a net of 2 ATP molecules being produced. Write that down. I do want you to be able to tell me how many ATP units are being generated at each stage of aerobic respiration. Okay. The next step in aerobic respiration is the Krebs cycle. Okay, I don't have a 2 written here, but there's going to be 2 molecules of ATP generated from the Krebs cycle. Okay. I mentioned that the electron transport chain is the most productive stage of aerobic respiration, and it's going to produce 32 molecules of ATP for a grand total of about 36 ATPs being generated from cellular respiration from breaking down 1 molecule of glucose. So if we went back here and if I showed you a schematic that sort of looked like this from a big picture standpoint, I would like for you to be able to tell me a few things. One, I would like for you, like if I showed you this and I blanked out the names of each of these stages, like what's happening by name, could you name them? Okay. If I asked you about the cellular location of each one of these processes, you should be able to tell me that glycolysis is happening out in the cytoplasm and that the Krebs cycle in the electron transport chain is taking place inside of the mitochondria. And then I would like for you to be able to tell me how many net ATP molecules are made from each stage. Okay, we get 2 from glycolysis, we get 2 from Krebs cycle, and we're going to get 32 from the electron transport chain for a grand total of about 36 molecules of ATP being produced from a single breakdown of glucose from 1 glucose molecule. Now, of course, this is under, optimal conditions. Everything's happening the way that it should in the most ideal situation. Obviously, there are biological factors that can influence how much ATP is actually generated from the breakdown of 1 glucose molecule, but this is what happens under most optimal conditions. Okay. So again, just to put some things in writing, I know some of us are visual. Glycolysis, we said, is the first stage of cellular respiration. We said that it occurs in the cytoplasm, and this is information you should have in your notes. It does require an input of energy. So if I were to ask you sort of some true or false type questions, you do understand that there's going to be an input of energy in order to get this process started. No oxygen is utilized at the stage of glycolysis. So we can say that this process can start in the presence or absence of oxygen because this step doesn't require oxygen to be present. And we're going to end up with a net of 2 ATP molecules. This is glycolysis, the first stage in cellular respiration. So the schematic here, don't get overwhelmed. It's just showing you what's happening during cellular respiration, all right? So let's walk through this schematic. This orange or peach section of our diagram represents the external environment, extracellular environment, okay? Our cell membrane is represented here by this black line, and then all of this gray portion is inside of the cell, right? So we've consumed some food and we want these glucose molecules to be transported into the cell, all right? Glucose is transported into the cell and the process of cellular respiration begins with glycolysis, okay? Glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration. That glucose is gonna be broken down to pyruvate, right, as our first intermediate molecule, and there are going to be a very small amount of ATP generated. We get 2 molecules of ATP from glycolysis, right? So once that pyruvate is generated, now we have our sort of rate limiting stage. If there's oxygen present, cellular respiration will continue over in the mitochondria, right? If there is no oxygen present, then the cell shifts into an anaerobic respiration that we call fermentation. And we'll talk about that in our next class. But right now we're focusing on aerobic respiration. So glycolysis begins, we get our 2 units of ATP generated. Pyruvate is an intermediate molecule that will continue to be metabolized. And in the presence of oxygen, this process is going to continue in the mitochondria. And then the Krebs cycle continues. And so this TCA is also another name for the Krebs cycle. So the citric acid cycle continues in the mitochondria. We get two molecules of ATP being produced here. And then we continue into the electron transport chain where we're going to have our most efficient production of ATP. And we're going to end up with about 32 units of ATP being produced from that electron transport chain. Okay. And so again, if you saw a schematic like this, and I'm going to admonish you to go out after class today and maybe watch a video or two on YouTube that kind of illustrates a little bit more about what's happening with cellular respiration. And again, there are a lot of other excuse me, factors or players that are involved in this, but we're just going to kind of stay on the surface for right now and understand that when glucose is transported into the cell, the first stage of breaking down that glucose is glycolysis, and then pyruvic acid is going to be generated. In the presence of oxygen, the rest of cellular respiration will continue. Okay, so the final stages of aerobic respiration after glycolysis, they're completed in the mitochondria, right? And now these final stages do require the presence of oxygen, right? Because we said this is aerobic respiration. In the absence of oxygen, this process would take another turn to anaerobic respiration if there's no oxygen present after glycolysis, all right? So aerobic respiration is completed in the mitochondria. So that's where we have the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. We get a total yield of about 36 ATP molecules per glucose, right, during aerobic respiration. Okay. This is just another image of our summary of what happens during aerobic respiration. Glycolysis attempts to start by breaking down glucose into pyruvic acid. We get our 2 molecules of ATP. The Krebs cycle generates another 2 molecules of ATP. The electron transport chain is going to generate 32 molecules of ATP for a grand total of about 36 molecules of ATP being generated, right? Now, some sources that you'll look at, you'll see the number 38 being generated in total, but we have used 2. So remember, I don't know if you remember in my initial slide, I said that energy was required. So we used energy during glycolysis. So we're going to use 2 molecules of energy throughout this whole process. So we're going to have a net yield of 36 and not 38. All right, so again, this is just for those of us that are visual. The final stages of aerobic respiration take place over here in the mitochondria. We have the citric acid cycle yielding 2 molecules of ATP, the electron transport chain yielding 32. All right, so you should be able to summarize these, that in total, what you should have in your notes is that aerobic respiration yields under optimal conditions a total of 36 ATP units. We're going to stop right here today. I want you to complete these 3 checkpoint questions, and you're going to submit them into Blackboard. Go ahead and jot down these questions. Very simple. You should be able to answer them in your notes without too much problems after today's lesson.